In the quiet hallways of St. Mary's Rehabilitation Center, there was a nurse who stood out not because she was louder or busier than the others, but because she carried a certain warmth with her. Her name was Clara, and she had been working at the center for years. She wasn't new to tough cases, patients who came in broken both physically and emotionally, but none of them had ever stayed in her mind like this one man did. His name was Daniel Hartley. He wasn't old, maybe in his mid-40s, but he looked much older than that. A car accident 6 months ago had left him alive, yes, but barely. His body had healed enough to let him sit up and eat on his own, but his mind, well, it seemed, trapped somewhere far away. Every day, Daniel would sit by the window in his wheelchair, staring outside as if waiting for something, or someone, that never showed up. No matter what anyone said or did, he didn't respond. Not a word, not even a blink. It was as though he had locked himself inside his own world and no one held the key. Clara first met Daniel when she was assigned to take care of him. At first, she treated him like any other patient. She gave him his medicine on time, made sure he was comfortable, and spoke softly while adjusting his blankets or fixing his pillows. But after a few weeks, she noticed something strange. Even though Daniel didn't say anything, he wasn't completely absent either. Sometimes when she leaned closer to check on him, she could swear she saw his eyes flicker, not just randomly, but almost like he was trying to follow her movements. It was subtle, so small that most people might have missed it, but Clara caught it every time. That's when curiosity started tugging at her. Who was this man behind the silence? What was going through his mind as he stared out the window day after day? Clara decided to try harder. Maybe he needed more than just basic care. Maybe he needed connection. So she began bringing little things to share with him during her shifts. One day, it was an old book she loved. A story about a man finding hope after losing everything. The next day, it was a playlist of songs from different eras. She'd play the music softly in the background, watching closely to see if anything sparked a reaction. At first, nothing changed. Daniel remained silent, his gaze fixed on some invisible point beyond the glass. But Clara didn't give up. Instead, she started reading the book aloud to him, chapter by chapter, pausing occasionally to glance at his face. Most days he didn't move. But once, when she read a line about forgiveness, she thought she saw his fingers twitch ever so slightly on the armrest of his wheelchair. Was it coincidence, or was he listening? It was moments like these that kept Clara coming back. Slowly, she found herself looking forward to her time with Daniel. She began talking to him more, sharing bits and pieces of her own life. "You know," she'd say, "my son loves dinosaurs. He can tell you the name of every single one, even the weird ones nobody's heard of." Or, "I used to hate rainy days until I realized how cozy they feel with a cup of tea and a good movie." She didn't expect answers, but somehow it felt right to fill the silence between them. Her co-workers often teased her about spending so much time with Daniel. "He's not going to talk, Clara," one of them said one day. "Some people are too far gone." But Clara shook her head. She couldn't explain why, but she believed deep down that Daniel wasn't unreachable. There was something still alive in him, buried under layers of pain and guilt. She just had to find a way to bring it to the surface. One afternoon, Clara brought a photo album from home. Flipping through the pages, she showed Daniel pictures of her family, her kids laughing at the park, her husband grilling burgers on a summer evening. She pointed to each picture, telling him stories about the people in them. When she got to a photo of her youngest daughter holding a puppy, she paused. Looking over at Daniel, she noticed his eyes weren't focused on the window anymore. They were on her. For the first time since she'd known him, he seemed present. Clara's heart skipped a beat. She smiled softly and placed the album on his lap. "What do you think?" she asked, even though she knew he wouldn't answer. Still, she waited, letting the question hang in the air. And then, without warning, Daniel raised his hand. It was shaky, unsteady, but deliberate. He touched the edge of the photo album, his fingers brushing against the glossy page. Clara froze, unsure if she was imagining things. But no, His hand was really moving. Tears welled up in her eyes as she watched him trace the outline of the picture. In that moment, she felt something shift. Whatever wall Daniel had built around himself was beginning to crack. He wasn't just a silent figure sitting by the window anymore. He was a person, someone who could still feel, even if he couldn't yet speak. From that day on, Clara poured even more of herself into caring for Daniel. She started noticing tiny changes in him, things that others might overlook, like the way he turned his head slightly when she entered the room, or how his breathing seemed to sync with the rhythm of her voice when she read to him. Each little sign gave her hope, fueling her determination to break through whatever darkness held him captive. But Clara also knew that reaching Daniel wouldn't be easy. Behind his silence lay something heavy, something painful. Whatever it was, it had pushed him into this state of withdrawal. And while she couldn't force him to open up, she could keep showing up, day after day, offering patience, kindness, and understanding. Because sometimes that's all it takes. One person willing to believe in you when everyone else has given up. As the weeks went by, Clara continued visiting Daniel, sharing stories, playing music, and simply being there. She didn't know when, or if, he would finally speak. But she was certain of one thing. Daniel wasn't alone. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start pulling him back into the light. As the days turned into weeks, Clara noticed something remarkable about Daniel. It wasn't anything big or dramatic, at least not at first, but it was enough to make her heart race with hope. One morning, as she adjusted his blanket, she saw his fingers twitch ever so slightly. It was such a small movement, almost like a reflex, but Clara knew better. She had spent enough time with him to recognize that this wasn't random. It was intentional. Her breath caught in her throat as she leaned closer. "Did you feel that?" she whispered, her voice trembling with excitement. Of course, Daniel didn't respond. His hands remained still again, and his gaze stayed fixed on the window. But Clara couldn't ignore what she'd just seen. That tiny flicker of movement, it was proof that he wasn't completely lost. Somewhere deep inside, he was still there, fighting his way back. From that moment on, Clara became even more observant. She started paying attention to every little detail, no matter how insignificant it seemed. If Daniel blinked when she spoke, she noted it. If his head tilted slightly toward a sound, she celebrated it silently. Each of these moments, however, small, felt like stepping stones leading him out of the darkness. To encourage more interaction, Clara decided to get creative. She brought in objects that might spark some kind of response. A soft ball, a deck of cards, even a small potted plant. She placed them near him, talking about each item as if they were old friends. "This one's a succulent," she said cheerfully, holding up the little green plant. "It doesn't need much water, but it loves sunlight. Kind of like me, I guess." She waited, watching for any sign of interest. At first, nothing happened. But then, one afternoon, as she rolled the soft ball between her hands, Daniel's eyes followed it. Just for a second, but it was enough. Clara's face lit up with a grin. "You see that?" she asked, rolling the ball gently toward him. "What do you think? Should we play catch?" Of course, Daniel didn't grab the ball or throw it back, but his eyes stayed on it longer this time, and Clara took that as a victory. Every tiny step forward was worth celebrating, no matter how slow the progress seemed. Music became another tool in Clara's efforts to connect with Daniel. She remembered reading somewhere that music could reach people in ways words often couldn't. So she began playing songs from different eras, hoping to find something that resonated with him. One day she chose an old classic, Hallelujah, by Leonard Cohen. The melody filled the room, soft and haunting, wrapping around them like a warm embrace. Clara glanced over at Daniel as she hummed along. His expression hadn't changed, but she thought she saw the corner of his mouth quiver, just for a split second. Was it sadness? Longing? Whatever it was, it made her heart ache. She stopped humming and reached for his hand, holding it gently. "Do you like this song?" she asked softly. Again, there was no verbal response, but his fingers curled slightly around hers, as if acknowledging her presence. These moments, though fleeting, gave Clara renewed energy. She started personalizing their sessions even more, bringing in things that reminded her of Daniel's generation. Old magazines, black and white photographs, even snippets of news stories from decades past. She showed him pictures of iconic events, the moon landing, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and told him stories about how those moments had shaped the world. "You probably remember this," she said one day, holding up a faded photograph of a crowded street during the 1960s. People were marching for change, demanding justice. "Doesn't that feel like something we could use today too?" Daniel didn't nod or smile, but Clara swore she saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes. It was as if he was piecing together fragments of a life he'd once lived, slowly reconnecting with the person he used to be. Her colleagues continued to warn her not to get too attached. "He might never come out of it," one of them said bluntly. "Some people are just gone." But Clara refused to listen. She had seen too many signs to give up now. There was something about Daniel's silence that felt protective rather than permanent, as if he was hiding from something or someone. Late one evening, after everyone else had left for the day, Clara sat beside Daniel in his room. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the floor. She picked up a book she'd been reading aloud to him, a story about redemption and second chances, and opened it to where they'd last stopped. As she read, her voice steady and calm, she felt Daniel shift slightly in his chair. It was such a minor movement, but it sent a wave of hope through her. When she finished the chapter, she closed the book and looked at him. "I know you're in there," she said softly, "and whenever you're ready, I'll be here. You don't have to rush. Take all the time you need." For a brief moment, Daniel's eyes met hers. They weren't empty anymore. They were filled with something raw and unspoken, pain perhaps, or maybe regret. Whatever it was, it made Clara's chest tighten. She reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "You're not alone," she whispered. "We'll figure this out together." That night, as Clara walked home, she replayed the day's events in her mind. The twitch of his fingers, the flicker of emotion in his eyes. It all added up to something bigger than she could fully understand yet. Daniel was still locked away, yes, but the walls were starting to crumble, and Clara was determined to be there when they finally fell. Over the next few weeks, Daniel continued to show signs of improvement. He began turning his head toward sounds, more consistently following objects with his gaze and occasionally gripping Clara's hand when she offered it. These incremental steps gave everyone at the center hope, especially Clara, who now believed more than ever that Daniel's voice would return. But Clara also knew that reaching Daniel wasn't just about physical responses. It was about breaking through the emotional barriers he'd put up. Whatever trauma he was carrying, it was heavy enough to silence him completely. And while she couldn't force him to confront it, she could keep creating a safe space for him to heal. Every day, Clara came to work with a renewed sense of purpose. She didn't know how long it would take for Daniel to speak again, or if he ever would, but she was willing to wait. Because sometimes healing isn't about rushing the process. It's about being patient, showing up, and letting someone know they're not alone. And as Clara sat beside Daniel, holding his hand and speaking softly, she felt a quiet certainty settle over her. This journey wasn't just about helping Daniel find his way back. It was also about reminding herself why she had become a nurse in the first place. To care for people, to believe in them, and to help them rediscover the light within themselves, even when it seemed impossible. Months had passed since Clara first noticed the tiny flicker of life in Daniel. The twitch of his fingers, the way his eyes followed objects, the faintest hints that he was still present beneath the silence. Each day brought new challenges and small victories, but nothing could have prepared her for what happened next. It was a crisp Tuesday morning when everything changed. The air outside was cool, carrying the scent of fresh rain from the night before. Inside St. Mary's Rehabilitation Center, the usual hum of activity filled the halls. Nurses chatting softly, the squeak of rubber-soled shoes on tiled floors, the distant beep of medical equipment. But in Daniel's room it was quiet, almost too quiet. Clara entered as she always did, balancing a tray with his breakfast and a steaming cup of tea. She greeted him warmly, even though she didn't expect a response. "Good morning," she said, setting the tray down on the bedside table. "I brought your favorite today, oatmeal with honey. And look, I added a little cinnamon this time. You used to like that, didn't you?" She turned to face him, adjusting the blanket over his lap. That's when it happened. As she leaned closer to fix the pillow behind his back, Daniel suddenly reached out. His hand trembled as it moved almost hesitantly until it touched hers. Clara froze, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, Daniel's fingers wrapped around her hand, gripping it weakly, but deliberately. Tears welled up in Clara's eyes as she looked at him. His gaze was fixed on her now, no longer drifting off toward the window or some unseen point in the distance. It was intense, filled with emotions she couldn't quite place. Longing, fear, maybe even gratitude. Whatever it was raw and real. "You're here," Clara whispered, her voice shaking. "I've been waiting for you." Daniel didn't say anything, but his grip tightened slightly, as if to reassure her that he understood. Clara stayed kneeling beside him, holding his hand and letting the moment stretch out. She didn't rush him or push for more. Instead, she simply smiled through her tears. "Whenever you're ready, Daniel," she murmured. "Take your time." That single touch marked a turning point. Over the following days, Daniel began responding more frequently. He would turn his head toward sounds, follow Clara's movements with his eyes, and occasionally squeeze her hand when she offered it. These gestures were small, but they spoke volumes. They told Clara that Daniel was fighting his way back, one step at a time. Encouraged by this progress, Clara decided to take things further. She started taking him outside whenever the weather allowed, wheeling him into the garden where the sun warmed their skin and the smell of blooming flowers filled the air. At first, Daniel seemed overwhelmed by the change in scenery. His body stiffened and his breathing grew shallow, as if he wasn't sure how to process the world beyond the walls of his room. But Clara stayed by his side, speaking softly and reassuring him. "It's okay," she said during one of these outings. "You're safe here. Just breathe." As they sat under a tree, watching leaves sway gently in the breeze, Clara noticed something remarkable. Daniel's shoulders relaxed and his gaze softened. For the first time in months, he didn't seem lost in thought or trapped in some invisible prison. He was present, soaking in the sights and sounds around him. Clara felt a lump rise in her throat as she realized just how far he'd come, from staring blankly at a window to experiencing the beauty of nature again. Back inside, Clara continued personalizing their sessions, tailoring them to what she thought might interest Daniel. One afternoon, she brought in a sketch pad and colored pencils, placing them on the table between them. "Do you remember drawing?" she asked, opening the pad to a blank page. "Maybe we can try it together." Daniel stared at the materials, for a long moment his brow furrowing slightly. Then hesitantly he reached out and picked up a pencil. His hand shook as he pressed it to the paper, leaving faint, uneven lines. Clara watched silently, resisting the urge to guide him. This wasn't about creating art, it was about expression. After several minutes, Daniel stopped and pushed the sketch pad away, frustration evident in his expression. "It's okay," Clara said quickly, placing a comforting hand on his arm. "We'll keep trying. There's no rush." Despite setbacks like these, Daniel's progress was undeniable. He began participating in activities that required minimal effort, a game of catch using a soft ball, sorting colorful blocks by shape and size, listening intently as Clara read aloud from books. Each task was simple, yet meaningful. They helped rebuild not only his physical strength but also his confidence. One evening, as Clara tucked Daniel into bed, she paused and looked at him thoughtfully. "You know," she said, her tone light and conversational, "you've come so far. I'm proud of you." For a brief moment, Daniel's lips curved upward into what might have been the hint of a smile. It was fleeting, gone almost as soon as it appeared, but Clara caught it. Her heart swelled with emotion as she realized just how much Daniel had begun to trust her. He wasn't just responding to stimuli anymore. He was connecting with her on a deeper level. But as thrilled as Clara was with Daniel's progress, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something holding him back. Beneath his growing responsiveness lay a heaviness, an unspoken burden that weighed him down. Clara knew instinctively that Daniel's silence wasn't just about recovery, it was about protection. He was shielding himself from something painful, something he wasn't ready to face. Late one night after finishing her shift, Clara found herself reflecting on Daniel's journey. She thought about the countless hours she'd spent by his side, the moments of hope and despair, the tiny victories that kept her going. Caring for someone like Daniel wasn't easy. It demanded patience, empathy, and an unwavering belief in the possibility of healing. Yet despite the challenges, Clara wouldn't trade the experience for anything, because every step Daniel took toward recovery reminded her why she became a nurse in the first place: to help people find their way back to themselves. And though the road ahead was uncertain, Clara was determined to walk it with him one day at a time. As she drifted off to sleep that night, Clara allowed herself to dream of the future, a future where Daniel's voice returned, where he laughed freely and lived fully once more. She didn't know how long it would take for that vision to become reality, but she was willing to wait. Because sometimes, the most profound transformations happen quietly, in the spaces between words and actions, shaped by love, patience, and unwavering faith. It was a rainy Tuesday evening, the kind of night where the world outside felt hushed and heavy, as if the sky itself was holding its breath. Inside St. Mary's Rehabilitation Center, the dim glow of the hallway lights cast long shadows along the walls. Most of the patients were already asleep, their rooms quiet except for the occasional rustle of sheets or soft snores. But in Daniel's room, something extraordinary was about to happen. Clara had stayed late that night, tidying up his space before heading home. She didn't mind the extra time. It gave her a chance to reflect on the day and prepare mentally for tomorrow. As she folded a blanket and placed it neatly at the foot of his bed, lightning flashed outside, briefly illuminating the room. The sudden brightness startled her, but what truly made her freeze was the sound of a voice, weak, raspy, and barely audible. Clara, her heart skipped a beat. Had she imagined it? She turned slowly, her eyes wide with disbelief, and found Daniel staring directly at her. His gaze was intense, piercing through the dim light like he was seeing her for the first time. For months, she dreamed of this moment, the moment when he would finally break his silence, but now that it was happening, she wasn't sure how to react. "Daniel," she whispered, stepping closer. "Is that you?" He swallowed hard, his throat dry from disuse, then clearer this time. "Clara." The tears came instantly, streaming down her face without warning. She knelt beside him, gripping his hand tightly. "Yes, Daniel, I'm here. I've been here. What is it? Tell me." For a long moment he just looked at her, his eyes filled, with a mixture of pain and relief. Clara could see the weight of whatever he was carrying pressing down on him, threatening to overwhelm him even as he tried to speak. She waited patiently, giving him the space he needed to find the words. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Daniel opened his mouth again. His voice was shaky, almost breaking under the strain of emotion. "I killed my wife," he confessed, each word landing like a punch to Clara's chest. She froze, her mind racing to process what he'd just said. The silence between them stretched out, thick and suffocating, until Clara forced herself to take a deep breath. "Tell me what happened, Daniel," she said gently, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "Start from the beginning." And so he did. Haltingly, painfully, Daniel recounted the events leading up to the car accident that had left him hospitalized and his wife dead. It started with an argument, a heated exchange fueled by anger and frustration. They had been driving home together when things escalated, their voices rising above the hum of the engine. In a moment of reckless fury, Daniel sped up, gripping the wheel too tightly, his judgment clouded by rage. Then came the screech of tires, the deafening crash, and the unbearable realization that he had caused the death of the person he loved most. As he spoke, tears streamed down his face, mingling with the raindrops sliding down the window pane. Clara listened intently, her heart breaking for him. She didn't interrupt or judge. She simply let him talk, knowing that this confession was as much about unburdening himself as it was about seeking forgiveness. When he finished, the room fell, silent except for the sound of rain tapping against the glass. Clara sat there holding his hand, trying to process everything he'd shared. The guilt, the grief, the sheer weight of his actions. It all made sense now. This was why he had retreated into silence, why he had shut himself off from the world. He couldn't face what he'd done, and he certainly couldn't face himself. But instead of recoiling from him, Clara felt an overwhelming surge of compassion. She understood now that Daniel wasn't just a man who had made a terrible mistake. He was a human being consumed by regret, desperate for redemption. And though his confession shook her to her core, it also clarified her role in his journey. She wasn't just his caregiver anymore. She was his anchor, someone who could help him navigate the turbulent waters of guilt and shame. "Thank you for telling me," Clara said finally, her voice soft but firm. "That must have been incredibly hard." Daniel nodded weakly, unable to meet her eyes. His body trembled slightly, as if the act of speaking had drained every ounce of energy from him. Clara reached out and placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone in this," she continued. "We'll get through it together, okay?" He didn't respond, but the tension in his posture eased ever so slightly. Clara stayed with him for a while longer, letting the silence settle between them. When she finally stood up to leave, she leaned down and kissed his forehead lightly. "Rest now," she said. "We'll talk more tomorrow." The next morning, Clara arrived at the center earlier than usual, her mind replaying Daniel's confession over and over. She knew that helping him heal wouldn't be easy, not just physically but emotionally and spiritually as well. Guilt like his didn't disappear overnight. It lingered, haunting every thought and action until it was confronted head-on. Determined to support him, Clara sought advice from the center's therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Patel who specialized in trauma recovery. Together, they devised a plan to help Daniel work through his emotions. Therapy sessions, journaling exercises, and mindfulness practices were introduced gradually, allowing Daniel to process his feelings at his own pace. At first, Daniel resisted. Talking about his wife and the accident brought back waves of anguish that left him physically exhausted. But Clara remained steadfast, reminding him that healing required vulnerability. "It's okay to feel pain," she told him one afternoon. "Pain means you're alive. And being alive means there's still hope." Slowly but surely, Daniel began opening up, not just to Clara but to others as well. During group therapy sessions, he shared snippets of his story, admitting his mistakes and expressing remorse. To everyone's surprise, his honesty inspired others to do the same. A young man who had lost his leg in a motorcycle accident spoke about his fear of never walking again. An elderly woman who rarely interacted with anyone revealed her struggles with loneliness after losing her husband. For the first time, the group became a safe space for sharing, healing, and supporting one another. Clara watched proudly as Daniel took ownership of his actions. He wrote letters to his late wife, pouring out his apologies and memories onto paper. He volunteered for community service projects organized by the rehab center, finding solace in helping others. Each step forward was difficult, but it brought him closer to the person he wanted to become. A man defined not by his failures, but by his willingness to change. One day, during a particularly emotional session, Daniel turned to Clara and said, "I don't know if I'll ever forgive myself, but maybe I can learn to live with it." Clara smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "That's all any of us can do, Daniel. Learn to live with our pasts while striving to be better in the future." His words resonated deeply with her, not just because of what they meant for Daniel, but because of what they reminded her about herself. Caring for him had taught her invaluable lessons about resilience, empathy, and the power of human connection. It had shown her that no matter how broken someone might seem, there's always a chance for renewal, if only they have someone willing to believe in them. As the weeks passed, Daniel continued making strides. His physical health improved, and his emotional wounds began to heal, albeit slowly. He started spending more time outdoors, enjoying the sunshine and fresh air. Sometimes Clara joined him, sitting quietly as they watched birds flit between trees or listened to children laughing in the distance. These moments, though simple, carried a profound sense of peace. Yet even as Daniel grew stronger, Clara couldn't ignore the conflicting emotions swirling within her. On one hand, she was proud of how far he'd come. On the other, she struggled with the knowledge of what he had done. Could she truly move past it? Was it possible to separate the man he was now from the man he had been? These questions weighed heavily on her, but she refused to let them overshadow the progress Daniel had made. Instead, she focused on the present, the way he smiled faintly. When she cracked a joke, the gratitude in his eyes whenever she entered the room, the quiet strength he displayed as he faced each new challenge. By spring, Daniel was ready to take the next big step, leaving the rehab center. His doctors agreed that he was stable enough to continue his recovery at home, surrounded by familiar surroundings and the possibility of rebuilding his life. Clara helped him pack his belongings, folding clothes and organizing personal items into boxes. As they worked side by side, neither of them spoke much, but the bond they had formed over the past months filled the silence. On his last day at St. Mary's, Daniel stood by the entrance clutching a small bag containing the essentials he'd need for the journey ahead. Clara walked him to the door, her heart swelling with pride and sadness. "You've come so far," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so proud of you." Daniel looked at her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "Thank you, Clara, for everything. I couldn't have done it without you." She hugged him tightly, feeling the warmth of his gratitude radiate through her. When they finally pulled apart, she stepped back and smiled. "You saved yourself, Daniel. I just reminded you that you were worth saving." As he walked away, disappearing into the sunlight, Clara stood there for a moment, watching until he was out of sight. Then, taking a deep breath, she turned and headed back inside. There were more patients waiting for her care, more stories to listen to, and more lives to touch. But as she returned to her duties, Clara knew one thing for certain. Daniel's journey had changed her forever. It had reminded her why she chose this path: to nurture, to heal, and to give people a second chance at life. And though their paths might never cross again, the impact they had on each other would remain etched in her heart for years to come. By the time spring rolled around, Daniel had transformed in ways that no one, least of all Clara, could have imagined when he first arrived at St. Mary's Rehabilitation Center. The man who once sat silently by the window, staring into nothingness, was now a shadow of his former self, but not in the way people might think. This new version of Daniel was quieter than most, yes, but there was a depth to him now, a sense of purpose that hadn't existed before. He still carried the weight of what he'd done, but instead of letting it crush him, he used it as fuel to rebuild his life. Therapy sessions became a cornerstone of Daniel's recovery. At first, he hesitated to open up even in those safe spaces, worried about being judged or misunderstood. But Clara encouraged him gently, reminding him that facing his guilt wasn't about erasing it. It was about learning to live with it. "You can't change the past," she told him one afternoon after a particularly tough session, "but you can decide how it shapes your future." Her words stuck with him. Slowly, Daniel began sharing more during therapy, not just about the accident, but about everything that led up to it. He talked about his marriage, the arguments, the pressures of work and family life that had slowly chipped away at their relationship. He admitted things he'd never said aloud before, how he'd felt trapped, overwhelmed, and unable to ask for help. And though admitting these truths didn't erase the pain, it lightened the burden he'd been carrying alone for so long. One day, Daniel surprised everyone, including himself, by volunteering to speak during a group activity. It was a storytelling session where patients shared moments from their lives that shaped who they were today. Most people kept their stories lighthearted, talking about childhood memories or funny mishaps. But when it was Daniel's turn, he chose to share something deeply personal. "I caused a car accident," he began, his voice steady despite the tremor beneath it. "My wife, she didn't make it." The room fell silent, every eye on him. For a moment, Daniel faltered, unsure if he could continue. Then, taking a deep breath, he went on. "I'll carry that guilt for the rest of my life, but I'm learning to forgive myself. Not because I deserve it, but because staying stuck won't bring her back." When he finished speaking, no one clapped or cheered. Instead, the group sat in solemn silence, absorbing the weight of his words. One by one, they began nodding, offering quiet words of support. A young woman who had lost her leg in an accident reached out and touched his hand. "Thank you for sharing that," she said softly. "It helps us too." That moment marked a turning point for Daniel. Until then, he had seen his confession as something shameful, something to hide away. But seeing how others responded to his honesty made him realize that vulnerability wasn't weakness, it was strength. By opening up, he gave permission for others to do the same. In turn, their courage inspired him to keep moving forward. Clara watched all of this unfold with a mix of pride and wonder. She had always believed in Daniel's potential, but witnessing his transformation firsthand filled her with a profound sense of fulfillment. Still, she couldn't ignore the complexity of her own emotions. Hearing his confession months earlier had shaken her deeply, forcing her to confront uncomfortable questions about forgiveness and justice. Could someone who had caused such harm truly deserve a second chance? And if so, what did that say about her role in helping them? These thoughts lingered in the back of her mind, especially on days when Daniel seemed to struggle more than usual. There were mornings when he woke up visibly upset, his eyes red from crying or lack of sleep. On those days, Clara would sit beside him, listening patiently as he worked through whatever memory or emotion had surfaced overnight. Sometimes he apologized profusely, as if afraid she might abandon him if he revealed too much of his darkness, but Clara never wavered. "You're allowed to feel this way," she reassured him. "Healing isn't linear. Some days will be harder than others, and that's okay." As spring turned into early summer, Daniel started taking small steps toward independence. With Clara's encouragement, he began participating in community service projects organized by the rehab center. These initiatives ranged from planting trees in local parks to volunteering at food banks. At first, Daniel approached these activities cautiously, unsure if he deserved to contribute after everything he'd done. But over time, he found joy in helping others, realizing that while he couldn't undo his mistakes, he could still make a positive impact. One Saturday morning, Clara accompanied Daniel to a neighborhood cleanup event. Together, they picked up trash along a stretch of road lined with wildflowers. As they worked side by side, Daniel glanced at her and smiled faintly. "Do you think I'll ever stop feeling guilty?" he asked, his tone lighter than usual. Clara paused, considering her answer carefully. "Probably not completely," she admitted. "But that doesn't mean you let it control you. Guilt reminds us of our humanity. It shows we care. What matters is what you do with it." Daniel nodded thoughtfully, returning to the task at hand. Watching him, Clara felt a surge of hope. He wasn't perfect, and neither was his journey, but he was trying. And sometimes, trying was enough. Despite Daniel's progress, Clara wrestled with her own feelings. Caring for him had changed her in ways she hadn't anticipated. She admired his resilience and appreciated the lessons he had taught her about compassion and forgiveness. Yet part of her still struggled with the idea of supporting someone whose actions had caused such devastation. Was it possible to reconcile those conflicting emotions? Or would they always linger, unresolved? On nights when doubt crept in, Clara reminded herself why she had chosen this profession in the first place. Nursing wasn't just about fixing broken bodies. It was about mending spirits, offering comfort, and walking alongside people as they navigated their darkest moments. Daniel had tested her patience, challenged her beliefs, and forced her to grow in ways she hadn't expected. And though their journey together was far from easy, it was undeniably meaningful. As the weeks passed, Daniel continued making strides. His physical health improved dramatically, allowing him to move around more freely without assistance. His emotional well-being, while still fragile, showed signs of stability. He started attending weekly support groups outside the rehab center, connecting with others who understood his struggles. Each step forward brought him closer to reclaiming his life, and farther away from the man he used to be. One afternoon, as Clara helped Daniel prepare for an upcoming outing, he stopped mid-task and looked at her earnestly. "I want to thank you again," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. "Not just for taking care of me, but for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself." Clara smiled, brushing off his thanks with a wave of her hand. "You saved yourself, Daniel. I just reminded you that you were worth saving, her." Words hung in the air between them, simple yet powerful. They encapsulated everything their relationship had become, a partnership built on trust, empathy, and mutual growth. Though their paths would soon diverge, Clara knew that Daniel's journey would stay with her forever, shaping the way she cared for others in the future. As the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, casting golden hues across the rehab center's garden, Clara reflected on how far they had both come. Daniel was no longer the silent figure sitting by the window, lost in his own despair. He was a man determined to rise above his past, to find meaning in his suffering, and to honor the memory of his late wife by living a better life. And Clara? She had rediscovered the heart of her calling, reaffirming her belief in the power of human connection and the resilience of the human spirit. The road ahead wouldn't be easy for either of them, but as Clara stood watching the sunset, she felt a quiet certainty settle over her. No matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them armed with the lessons they had learned together. Because sometimes, healing isn't about finding all the answers. It's about embracing the questions, trusting the process, and holding on to hope, even when the path feels uncertain. The day finally came when Daniel was ready to leave St. Mary's Rehabilitation Center. It wasn't an easy decision for anyone, especially Clara, but they all knew it was the right one. Over the past months, Daniel had worked tirelessly to regain his strength and confront the guilt that had once consumed him. He wasn't fully healed, of course, and probably never would be. But he was stronger now, both physically and emotionally, and ready to take the next step toward rebuilding his life. On his last morning at the center, Daniel woke up earlier than usual. He sat by the window, watching as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees outside. For so long, this view had been a source of comfort during his darkest days. Now it felt like a farewell, a reminder of how far he'd come since those early weeks when he couldn't even bring himself to look at the world beyond the glass. Clara arrived shortly after breakfast, carrying a small box filled with mementos from their time together. Photographs she'd taken of him participating in activities, notes he'd written during therapy sessions, and a few trinkets he'd made during art class. She placed the box on his bed, smiling warmly. "I thought you might want these," she said, "to remind you of everything you've accomplished." Daniel opened the box carefully, running his fingers over the items inside. His eyes lingered on a folded piece of paper, a letter he'd written to his late wife during one of his therapy exercises. Tears welled up in his eyes as he traced the edges of the paper, remembering the pain and love that had poured out of him while writing. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion, "for everything." Clara shook her head, brushing off his gratitude with a soft smile. "You did the hard work, Daniel. I just helped guide you along the way." They spent the rest of the morning packing up his belongings. It was a quiet process, punctuated only by the occasional comment or shared memory. When they reached the stack of books Clara had read aloud to him, Daniel paused, picking up a worn copy of Hallelujah. "This one meant a lot to me," he admitted, holding it close. It gave me hope when I didn't think I deserved any. Clara nodded, her heart swelling with pride. That book, and every other effort she'd made, had been worth it. Seeing Daniel hold on to something that had brought him comfort reminded her why she loved her job so much. It wasn't about fixing people. It was about giving them tools to heal themselves. By noon, everything was packed and ready to go. Daniel stood by the entrance, clutching the box of mementos in a small bag containing his essentials. Clara walked him to the door, her steps slow and deliberate, as if trying to stretch out the moment just a little longer. Outside, the air was crisp and fresh, carrying the scent of blooming flowers and freshly cut grass. The sun shone brightly overhead, casting a warm glow across the parking lot. "This is it," Daniel said, turning to face Clara. His voice trembled, slightly, but there was determination in his eyes. "I don't know what's waiting for me out there, but I'm ready to try." Clara smiled, though tears threatened to spill down her cheeks. "You'll do great," she reassured him. "And remember, you're not alone. You have your support groups, your therapist, and everyone who believes in you." He nodded, swallowing hard. Then, without warning, he pulled her into a tight hug. Clara hugged him back, feeling the weight of everything they'd been through together press against her chest. When they finally pulled apart, Daniel looked at her earnestly. "Thank you, Clara, for never giving up on me. I'll never forget what you've done." She patted his arm gently, forcing herself to stay composed. "You saved yourself, Daniel. Don't ever forget that." With one final wave, Daniel turned and walked toward the waiting taxi. Clara watched him climb into the car, clutching his belongings tightly. As the vehicle pulled away, she raised her hand in farewell, her heart heavy, yet full. Though their journey together had ended, she knew that Daniel's story was just beginning. In the weeks that followed, Clara often found herself thinking about Daniel. How was he adjusting to life outside the center? Was he continuing with therapy? Had he found a way to honor his wife's memory while building a future for himself? These questions lingered in her mind, but she resisted the urge to check in too soon. Daniel needed space to navigate this new chapter on his own terms. Still, she couldn't help but feel a profound sense of fulfillment whenever she reflected on their time together. Caring for Daniel had taught her invaluable lessons about resilience, empathy, and the power of human connection. She had witnessed firsthand how someone could rise from the depths of despair and reclaim their life, not because they were perfect, but because they refused to give up. Her experience with Daniel also changed the way she approached her work. She became more patient, more attuned to the silent struggles her patients carried beneath the surface. She started noticing the small victories, the flicker of recognition in someone's eyes, the hesitant smile after weeks of silence, and celebrated them with renewed enthusiasm. Each patient reminded her that healing was rarely linear, but it was always possible with the right support. One afternoon, several months later, Clara received a letter in the mail. It was handwritten, the ink smudged in places as if the writer had struggled to keep their hands steady. Her heart skipped a beat as she recognized the familiar scrawl. It was from Daniel. Inside, he wrote about his progress since leaving the rehab center. He described attending regular therapy sessions, volunteering at a local shelter, and even reconnecting with old friends who had offered their support. "I still miss her every day," he confessed, referring to his late wife. "But I'm learning to carry that loss without letting it define me. I owe so much of that to you." The letter ended with a simple message. "Thank you for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself." Clara folded the letter carefully, tucking it into her desk drawer alongside other cherished memories. She felt a lump rise in her throat as she realized just how much Daniel's journey had impacted her. In helping him find redemption, she had discovered a deeper purpose within herself, a reminder that compassion and forgiveness could transform lives, including her own. As she returned to her duties, Clara carried Daniel's words with her, letting them guide her interactions with every patient she cared for. She understood now that healing wasn't about erasing the past or achieving perfection. It was about finding beauty in imperfection strength in vulnerability, and hope in the darkest moments. And though Daniel was no longer part of her daily routine, his presence remained alive in her heart, a testament to the enduring power of kindness, patience, and belief in the human spirit.